Hey everyone, welcome to Localism, the podcast that asks if we're putting our power in the right places. I'm your host and PJ Pants aficionado, Blunchley. In fact, to be precise, today I'm editing Blunchley. You might remember that last time we were in the middle of an episode about localism and organized labor. When I originally recorded the episode, I'd intended localism and organized labor to be jammed into one show, but then I ended up with like 3 hours worth of material. I wasn't going to subject you to that long of an episode, so I'm going back and cutting things up a bit so that localism and organized labor is instead going to be a two-parter. And since it's now a two-parter, I'm going to take a second here and do some quick summarizing of what we covered in the first chunk of the recording. Thanks for hanging with me on this one, folks. As you can tell, I'm pretty passionate about this topic, so I'm having even more trouble organizing my thoughts than I am usually. Before I jump into the summary, a quick acknowledgement. Yes, I have been on the loose and out of sight for about a month. I went home, I enjoyed a very nice holiday, and did not do anything at all relating to podcasts. So now, almost exactly a month after I released the last episode, here we are. I'm thinking that the release schedule is going to change a little bit in this upcoming year. That's because I recently changed jobs, and there's a few more demands on my time. I'm also going to change my approach slightly to these episodes. You know, these kind of long, hour and a half, ranty episodes are a lot of fun for me to write because they're about stuff I'm passionate about. But as the new year comes around and I think about how to grow the channel, I'm going to try and make slightly more short-ish content, try to reduce the length of episodes to closer to 25 minutes and a half an hour. I think that'll be more consumable for you all, my audience, who at the end of the day are the people I'm serving. It'll also be easier to produce under the constraints that I'm now currently under, given my change in profession and a few other things. I'm also going to be doing a little bit of rethinking of how I handle the YouTube shorts. Similar to the problems with podcast length, I think that the 3-minute shorts I've been doing lately aren't going to cut it. They don't get the engagement all the way through. I think something a little snappier would be better. So you're going to see shorter shorts come out from me. You'll probably see them come out a little less frequently, but I'm hoping that the product I can deliver to you all will be something a little bit more watchable and that can gain a little bit more traction if you want to share it with your friends or with your family or whatever. With that little show update out of the way, let's now get into what was covered in the first half of what was originally going to be one episode and has now turned into two. To begin, we discussed the fact that labor unions are enjoying a moment of pretty significant popularity right now, including among younger portions of the conservative MAGA base that are more comfortable with economic populism and are nostalgic for a time of perceived greater economic prosperity for people like them, a time that happened to coincide with the nation's highest unionization levels. Despite this popularity, unionization rates are in the toilet, with less than 10% of workers in America being unionized, and that number is being pumped by somewhat inflated unionization rates of federal workers. We thus started talking about this topic to answer the question of why high interest in unionization isn't translating into higher unionization levels in the American workplace. And we also asked whether the approach of localism, of giving our local governments significantly more legislative power, could help address this mismatch. Well, as we discovered through a very tortured, very long discussion, reason number one that nobody's making unionization happen is that it's super fucking difficult to figure out what set of laws you need to follow in order to unionize. There are 4 totally different kinds of unions and way more than 4 potential sets of laws that could apply to you depending on what kind of work you do. If you work for a railroad or airline or space company, maybe, you need to look to the Federal Railway Labor Act, which sets out a system of craft-based units. If you're in the private sector and you're not an agricultural worker or a domestic worker, then the Federal National Labor Relations Act is your game, and you'll be organizing on a shop-by-shop basis, though maybe multiple shops can be represented by the same national union, just in different units and under different contracts. If you're a public sector worker, then things vary a bit depending on if you're a federal public sector worker or a state public sector worker. If you're a federal public sector worker, then technically there is a federal law that may give you union rights as long as you don't belong to certain agencies. Though that law doesn't give the ability to bargain over wages or hours and also doesn't let you strike, so it's kind of bitch-made, and it also just gives the president the unilateral ability to go, sorry, no more unions in this agency because I say so, which Trump has been doing a lot lately. Things may be better for you if you're a state public sector worker, in which case you're going to look to state law rather than federal law for your union rights. Most states give at least teachers, firefighters, and police the right to unionize, with public transit workers like bus drivers also pretty commonly given union rights. But those rights often don't include the right to strike. And in any event, it's tough to paint with a broad brush because every state handles things a bit differently. Lastly, we have what I called private sector state law unions, which are probably the rarest type of American union. They work by using state law to provide union rights to types of workers that are explicitly not covered by federal law, most commonly agricultural workers. Because these types of unions are set out by state law, the way they work, once again, varies heavily state by state, and indeed, the majority of states don't provide agricultural union rights at all. In those few states that do, some control the rights of agricultural workers to go on strike or bargain over wages. Others, like California, actually allow agricultural workers to use certain striking or boycotting tactics that federal law would bar from an RLA or NLRA union. So in short, this shit is clear as mud. And you basically need to be an expert or lawyer to figure out what the fuck you're supposed to do in your specific situation if you want to unionize or if you want to get a union out of your workplace. Then we come to reason number 2, the independent contractor problem. So one of the few things that the laws in this confusing patchwork have in common are that they almost always apply only to a class of workers they define as employees. That means they don't apply, in other words, that the laws don't provide any unionization rights to, a class of workers known as independent contractors. What's an independent contractor? In theory, it's someone who is in business for himself and just gets brought on to do specific tasks for a client rather than someone who actually works for a company. An independent contractor probably pays their own employment taxes, sets their own hours, owns their own equipment, stuff like that. In practice, it's actually really fucking difficult to tell whether or not a worker is an independent contractor because the standard changes all the time depending on what politicals happen to be in charge of the relevant state or federal agencies. Even more confusingly, independent contractor is a term with definitions outside of the context of union law, for example with the IRS, and those definitions may not overlap with, say, what an independent contractor is for National Labor Relations Act purposes. Companies with lots of money hire lots of very smart lawyers to structure their employment relationships in such a way that the companies can simultaneously exert a ton of control over their workers, while also arguably still having those workers be independent contractors rather than employees with union rights. An example of that is Amazon, who sort of maybe contracts with independent deliverers rather than hiring people directly to deliver their packages. Or at least that's what Amazon would claim. Worker misclassification, or the practice of telling workers they're independent contractors when they're actually employees, is a huge trend in the private sector. And independent contractors get no union rights. If you're an independent contractor and you tell your boss, hey, I'm thinking about talking to some guys from the AFL-CIO, he can fire you on the spot, and you have no recourse. The upshot? In addition to figuring out which of like a million different labor law schemes you fit into, you also have to try and puzzle through the confusing-ass question of whether you're an independent contractor before you can go out and try to unionize. But when we left off last time, I was in the middle of saying that as bad as these factors are for unionization, they aren't even the worst forces pushing against labor. Instead, I was suggesting that the real terrible factors were a legal doctrine known as field preemption, and how fucking slowly and shittily the federal labor agencies do their jobs of enforcing the laws that protect labor rights. Let's run the intro after probably the longest period without running the intro in podcast history, and then jump back in to where I cut myself off. Okay, so field preemption. What is field preemption? Well, first let's do a brief refresher on how normal preemption works. Let's use state law versus federal law for the purposes of this example to dodge questions about how state and local law interact. But if you'd like to have those questions answered, go listen to our Dillon Rule and Home Rule episodes. Because federal law is the supreme law of the land, it does wins out over state law if the two conflict. If, say, Oregon's state government passed a law saying all AI companies have to pay 10% more in state taxes than other companies, and then the federal government passed a law that said no state may tax AI companies at a higher rate than they tax non-AI companies, what happens? Well, under preemption, the federal law preempts or wins out over the state law, and so Oregon has to throw its heightened AI tax into the shitter. Now, in that example, the conflict between federal law and the state law is obvious. The state law set heads, the federal law set tails, the two couldn't coexist. But just to make matters confusing, it is not the case that a state law needs to directly conflict with or be incompatible with a federal law in order to be preempted. This is where field preemption, sometimes called Garmin preemption in the context of National Labor Relations Act preemption, comes into play. This is a little confusing to explain, but I'll do my best. Essentially, courts will find field preemption when they read Congress as passing laws that are intended to be the final and total say on a particular subject matter. So say that the federal Congress passes a really detailed and comprehensive law about the kinds of ties that men are allowed to wear with suits. The Tie Act begins with a purposes preamble that says something like, "It is the policy of the United States that men wear ties that fit well, are made of a good material, and are of a color in keeping with their national character." The law then goes on to wax poetic about certain tie materials and styles, or whatever, that men are allowed to wear. Then, the important bit for our purposes, the Tie Act says, so long as someone is wearing a blue, red, or white tie with a suit, the employer cannot discipline him for being underdressed. The Tie Act doesn't say that states aren't allowed to provide protection for other kinds of ties. It doesn't say that red, white, and blue are the only kinds of tie colors that provide protection from discipline for being underdressed. So Maryland, a state which takes great pride in its state flag, passes a state tie act that says people wearing yellow ties, where the shade of yellow is the same color as the yellow in our state flag, are also protected from being disciplined for being underdressed as long as they're wearing it with a suit. But when a law firm disciplines a first-year associate for wearing a yellow tie to court, which is against the law firm's dress code policy, the first-year associate is out of luck when she tries to take her firm to court about the discipline. The firm successfully argues that when the feds passed the Federal Tie Act, that was supposed to be the end-all be-all about what kinds and colors of ties give you protection from dress disciplines. It was meant to, in the lawyer parlance, occupy the field of that particular subject matter. So even though the Federal Tie Act does not say anywhere that states aren't allowed to extend similar protections to yellow ties, and there is no explicit contradiction between the federal and state laws, the state law is preempted under field preemption. Here's another perspective on how to look at this field preemption stuff, one that, as we'll see, is especially helpful in the context of explaining how field preemption is dicking over organized labor. We can kind of think of normal preemption, aka conflict preemption, as setting out a floor of what states and localities are allowed to do. The feds pass a hypothetical law that says, hey, you're not allowed to not hire somebody because you run their genetic data and their genes show they're more likely than the average person to get cancer. Simple enough. From then on, states at least must not pass any laws saying you're allowed to genetically test people for cancer risk and then not hire them if they have a high risk. That's like the floor of laws that now are preempted. In contrast, field preemption can kind of set out a ceiling of what laws states and localities can pass. Suppose that for whatever reason they can pull out of their asses, federal courts find that the federal No Genetic Testing for Cancer as a Condition of Employment Act occupies the field of the kinds of permissive genetic testing as a condition of employment. That means that states aren't allowed to, say, pass a law that says, in addition to cancer, you can't test employees' genetics for risk of Alzheimer's, diabetes, or heart disease. Since the feds have occupied the field of employment genetic testing, the states and localities aren't allowed to go above and beyond what the feds are doing. They aren't allowed to go above the ceiling of cancer genetic testing by passing laws that provide protection against other forms of genetic testing. You might be able to see where I'm going with this. Suppose that your state or your town takes a look at what's going on in your community and goes, sure looks like after employees win an NLRA or RLA or other labor election, the employers drag their feet at the bargaining table and contracts don't get signed for 3 or more years, which happens all the time, by the way. Hey, we in the community have an idea. Let's pass a local law saying that if the parties don't agree to a contract within a year after the election, we'll start fining the employer and the union for every week that passes until the parties agree to a contract. As far as I'm aware, there is no explicit provision in the NLRA or RLA that says states aren't allowed to penalize parties for not reaching a contract. But because the NLRA and RLA are seen as occupying the field of labor relations, even though there's nothing actually in those laws that should keep states from getting parties to move faster at the bargaining table, states and localities still are barred from doing so. And they're also barred from doing anything else above and beyond what is in those laws. Let me sum this up a bit more simply. Because of the way the federal preemption and field preemption work, states and localities can't provide any protections for unionization above and beyond what are currently in the often pretty milquetoast federal laws, ignoring the federal laws that give federal workers union rights because it makes sense that the feds get to set the rules about their own workers. That means even if everyone in your community strongly agrees that employers shouldn't be able to use certain bargaining tactics, or that elections should be faster, or that parties should be forced into arbitration if they can't agree to a contract, your community and even your state can't pass any laws about that, even if nothing in those laws contradicts anything in the RLA or NLRA. And here's one piece of the federal labor laws that is particularly egregious, one that is super frustrating that state and local governments aren't able to step in and correct. This example is NLRA focused, and a lot of the examples we're going to discuss from here on out are going to be NLRA focused, but I believe it applies to the RLA as well, though don't quote me on that. So suppose that you mention to your employer that you're pro-union, and his response is like, oh, you like unions, huh? Well, we don't employ people who like unions around here. You're fired. Now, this is a clear violation of the NLRA. You aren't allowed to fire someone just because they're pro-union. And you're also not allowed to fire someone just because they're anti-union, for what that's worth. Anyway, this dude literally said he was firing you just because of your union views. And that's clearly an unfair labor practice, which is just what a violation of the NLRA is called. What do you suppose the employer has to do under the NLRA when it commits an unfair labor practice by firing someone unlawfully? Well, as it turns out, all the employer has to do under the NLRA when it fires someone is just hire the person back if the person wants to come back and then give them back pay. That's right. The only thing an employer has to do is to make it like the person was never fired, to pay the unlawfully fired person whatever wages they should have earned. So putting aside morals and being a good person or whatever, morality is a concept very foreign to a lot of employers. Look at this from a strategic point of view. Suppose you're the company and there's an annoying pro-union guy in your shop. Why wouldn't you just take the risk and fire him? He may just accept the firing and not file an unfair labor practice charge with the NMB or NLRB. He might not know which agency to file with or how to go about it. He might fuck up in reporting what happened, and the NLRB or the NMB could decide not to take his case. There's a ton of ways that firing him, even if nominally unlawful, could solve all your annoying little union problems. And worst case, if the guy you fire figures it out and does everything right, and the NLRB comes knocking at your doorstep, you lose your case. All you have to do is just pay the guy like he's been working the whole time. It's just kind of like you pretend he was never fired at all. You make him whole. Hell, you might not even have to pay lawyers. You could just unlawfully fire the guy, and then, if he manages to navigate the thicket of NLRB processing, settle once a complaint shows up on your doorstep and pay the guy's back pay. At the end of the day, the other workers still got to watch you fire someone just for being pro-union. And maybe that'll stick in their minds when or if you ever get to a union election. But, and here's a fun little kick in the teeth, back pay is like the high watermark for the kinds of remedies that federal laws provide for unfair labor practices. A lot of the time, there's no money involved at all. Suppose that when your boss lands your pro-union guy, he doesn't come up to you and say you're fired. Instead, he just says, hey, you need to cut this union shit out or I'm going to fire you. In other words, he doesn't actually fire you, he just threatens to fire you. This, again, is very clearly unlawful, assuming you're an employee covered by federal labor law. You know what the remedy is for this violation? The thing that the law says your boss has to do, or like pay or whatever to make up for breaking federal law? Get this, he just puts up a piece of paper that, when translated from legalese, says, hey, I threatened someone, my bad, won't do it again, promise. This is called a notice posting remedy, and it is the sole remedy for a shit ton of unlawful and super coercive behavior under federal labor laws. You can see why this doesn't exactly inspire compliance in employers. I can threaten employees all I want, and all the feds can do is make me put up a piece of paper where I pinky promise not to do it again. Sign me up. If anything, a notice posting can almost be like a hunting license, and a way to let employees know that this workplace does not like unions and isn't afraid to violate federal law to keep them out. And if you're an employee whose boss is violating the federal labor laws and threatening or doing other kinds of stuff to you because you're pro-union, why are you going to go through the trouble of a years-long complicated process to report this to federal labor agencies and get a judgment if all that happens at the end of it is a piece of paper that gets posted in some corner of your workplace? Now, maybe you live in a community where you and your neighbors can see why these so-called penalties don't have enough bite to really matter. And you might think, hey, why doesn't the state or our municipal government pass some law that imposes an actual financial penalty on employers when they violate labor laws? We have similar penalties for all kinds of civil violations. we should hit them where it hurts and make them take these labor laws seriously. Hey, I think that's a great idea. Too bad that because of Garmin and field preemption, any attempt you made to do that would be preempted and ineffective, and so employers can just keep violating labor law with impunity because they have no incentive not to do so. This is truly field preemption as a ceiling at its very, very worst. And we wonder why pro-union sentiment doesn't translate into more unionization. So the substance of the labor laws and their penalties is fucked, and field preemption keeps localities from stepping in to add the oomph that these federal labor laws need. Well, even if the federal laws, they're not ideal, they're not perfect, at least the agencies in charge of enforcing them are doing a good job, right? They're probably very tight ships. I'm sure they get decisions out quickly and provide a steady hand at the wheel of federal labor policy free of political or other influence, right? And surely there hasn't been any earth-shattering developments over the past, 2 years or so that's totally thrown how these agencies work into chaos, right? Right? Oh boy. Okay. It is my deep regret to inform you that all of the federal labor agencies, and I do mean all of them, and I'm painting with a broad brush here, but just let me be a little polemic for a moment, are absolutely horrible at doing anything in a timely manner. I alluded to this before, but if you wanted to try and get an unfair labor practice heard and a violation found, you were looking at a years, not months, years-long process. Years. Just to get a piece of fucking paper posted or the pay that you should have had in the first place. Let's keep picking on the NLRB because it's the one that I could find data for. So under the NLRA, after you file a charge alleging your boss violated the NLRA, that charge goes through a couple of procedural stages. First, the regional office investigates the allegations. Then the regional office issues a complaint. A hearing date in front of an administrative judge gets set. The hearing takes place, which is usually a multi-week and sometimes even multi-month affair. Then, if the employer doesn't like how his case comes out, very common, it will appeal to the NLRB's 5 agency heads who then will look over the papers and issue a decision. In 2023, this whole process took, on average, 571 days. 571 days of you being out of a job or you getting fired in your workplace because there was this union campaign that was just starting to get going. And after you get fired, it just kind of sputters out because now everyone's afraid to try and actually sign on with a union. And you might be thinking, that's strange. 571 days in 2023? 2023 is a few years ago now. Why not use more recent data? Well, because as we'll get into shortly, some things have happened with federal agencies that make this 571-day measurement look positively lightning fucking fast in comparison to how things are now. Oh, and by the way, that 571-day number, that assumes your employer doesn't decide to appeal the NLRB to a federal circuit court, which can add another 1.5 to 2 years or longer to the process of getting a disposition to your case. Absolutely fucked. Now, why are these processing numbers so bad? Well, some of the shit isn't necessarily anybody's fault, or at least it isn't the agency's fault. As we've just spent some time discussing, these federal labor laws are really complicated. They present complicated interpretive issues. It takes time to work through how a particular case should come out, especially when how you determine the case that's in front of you could set precedent for every workplace in America. It's also true that all of these agencies, the NMB, the NLRB, have been chronically underfunded, and that underfunding is translated into understaffing, dramatically increasing case processing times. Federal politicians on both sides of the aisle are going to have companies and lobbyists whispering in their ears every time the subject of increasing the budget for federal labor enforcers comes up. And siphoning off funding over time is a great way to kill an agency in a way that doesn't make headlines and make constituents pissed off. You can say all the right things, position yourself as pro-labor, then just kill bills to increase funding in committee for decades and nobody really takes the heat. That's not really in the agency's control. But there is a whole lot here that is in the agency's control. For example, back and forth vacillation in policy. Okay, this one is a little tough to explain and honestly very tough for me to understand as not a legal expert, but here we go, I'm going to try my best. Basically, the NLRB and NMB go back and forth all the time on how they interpret the NLRA and the RLA. The independent contractor stuff we were talking about earlier is a great example of this. For 4 years, usually 4 years where there's a majority of Democrat appointees in the agencies, the definition of independent contractor will become pretty narrow, meaning that the agencies will find that very few workers are independent contractors, and thus that most workers are instead employees who are covered by federal union law. Then the pendulum swings the other way, and Republican appointees end up in charge, and they'll do the opposite, expand who counts as an independent contractor and thus reduce the number of employees who have labor rights. These aren't little swings at the margins either. We're talking thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of American workers who can wake up one day and be an independent contractor and then wake up the next day and not be. And that's just one area. There's other stuff too, like what kind of things you can or can't say as an employer during a union campaign, or what standard you use to interpret the language of a collective bargaining agreement, or in what circumstances an entity is or isn't considered a joint employer of a group of workers. For example, is capital M McDonald's, the big multinational corporation McDonald's, the employer of everyone who works at a McDonald's franchise or not? This back and forth on policy isn't just confusing and hard to follow for average people like us. It also is super inefficient, and it slows case processing times. Maybe the staff working on a case have to go back and scrub the recommendation because the law changed in the interim while they were having their case processed. Maybe a case that's going to change the law gets booted ahead in priority of other cases for processing, delaying less controversial cases while the quote-unquote more important one gets focused on. Maybe a case has to get remanded to an ALJ or opened up for parties to file more briefs in light of a change of legal standard. And appeals courts often hate when the NLRB overrides a prior standard, so you can bet that any case that involves a recently changed piece of law is pretty likely to end up in the swamp of federal appeals courts. These vacillations always show up when there's a turnover in administration, especially when the turnover in administration involves handing power off from one political party to another. So the NMB and NLRB had one set of standards in the Obama years, another in the first Trump term, still another in the Biden admin, and are in the process of switching all their standards once again now that Trump's in office for a second time. The other thing I'm about to complain about, something that is in the agency's control that contributes to really bad processing times, is a little more subjective. And that, with due respect to any federal workers listening, is that there is simply an entrenched sense of non-urgency with a lot of these federal agencies, especially at headquarters in Washington, D.C. Frontline staff are sometimes just not in any hurry to process cases. The average age of these staff is usually in the 40s or older. They're people who went into government work specifically because they saw it as a more laid-back and less demanding setting than the private sector work they'd been doing to that point. A lot of them, I'm sorry to say, are kind of just phoning it in, and they can because there's nobody to hold them accountable. Even the ones that aren't phoning it in may sort of forget to keep their eyes on the prize, making sure that ordinary people have their labor rights upheld. If you're an employee at the NMB or the NLRB, or I bet a lot of other state labor agencies, or hell, just agencies in general, you don't see or feel any connection with your work a lot of the time and the actual people or communities it affects. You just sit in your office in Washington, D.C. and work on your little technical subject matter. So it becomes very, very easy to lose sight of the fact that there are real people who are depending on you to be quick and efficient with your job. And instead, you're encouraged to focus on internal agency minutia or formatting or office politics or whatever. And that's just the bottom level staff. The supervisors aren't really helping either. For one, there's about 3 layers of supervision above frontline staff, far too many to actually have their input be useful or speed processing. Funny how all the reductions in funding and staff levels haven't translated necessarily into less supervisors, it's just translated into the same number of supervisors sticking around, supervising a smaller number of staff. For another, at least some of those supervisors are hand-picked by the political appointees that turn over every time an administration changes. So when those political appointees have their terms end, even more of the chain of command leaves with them. This results in, you guessed it, even more delay, as when a new NMB or NLRB appointee comes on board, they have to choose their front offices, which itself is a pretty political process, and get those high-level supervisors up to speed as well. Look, I'm no Doge fan, because anyone with eyes could see that Doge was a political stunt and a shit show whose job was mostly just to kneecap agencies that the powers that be found to be annoying. But the basic idea that federal agencies are extremely slow and inefficient and somebody needs to get in there and kick some asses to get things moving, that's true. And I know that's true because I myself used to work for the federal government, albeit not for one of the federal labor agencies. Now, anyone who is truly and actually dedicated to an efficient federal government will understand that sometimes the way to make things more efficient is actually to spend more money, to surge more funding to where it's needed, rather than strangling funding and leaving federal workers high and dry, but whatever. The whole kerfuffle over Doge has left people on the right saying that we need to just blow all these agencies up and take away all their money so they stop regulating the poor, innocent bank executives, which obviously isn't true. And people on the left saying that federal workers are all heroes of efficiency and dedication to fair and fast public service, which also definitely isn't true. Ugh. Seems pretty bad, right? Well, don't worry. Things will soon be getting even worse, thanks to everyone's favorite spray tan aficionado, Donnie T. To explain why requires a localism tangent TM, but this is one where going into the weeds is actually very important if we want to understand what's about to happen. So the federal labor agencies belong to a category of agency called independent agencies. What's an independent agency? Great question. Per Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution, the President has the power with, quote, the advice and consent of the Senate to appoint, another quote, officers of the United States. Officers of the United States is a phrase with a pretty technical meaning, but for our purposes, you just have to know that the heads of the labor agencies count as officers of the United States. So the Constitution gives the President power to name appointees to agencies, and then the Senate approves them. But what about when it comes to firing the heads of agencies? The Constitution doesn't say anything explicitly about that. And you also have to remember that when Congress creates an agency, basically what it is doing is passing a law that breaks off a little bit of power that would normally belong to Congress, for example, the power to make laws, and handing it off to the executive branch, in other words, the President. Because the power is being handed over from Congress, it just kind of makes sense that Congress has the ability to put some conditions or limits on that power. And in light of both the Constitution's silence on the firing issue and the logical concept that Congress should control how the President exercises power that Congress itself has delegated to him, Congress will sometimes limit the President's ability to fire agency heads. Specifically, Congress will say that agency heads can only be fired for cause, meaning that in order to be fired, agency heads have to fuck up and do something unethical or illegal or just be generally shit at their jobs. This means that the President can't just fire them at will or because they make a decision he disagrees with politically or just because he doesn't like them. As you can imagine, when Congress first came up with this little idea, the executive branch wasn't thrilled. This led to a populist, controversial president who had a unique idea of executive power, firing the head of an agency to test the waters and see whether these for-cause removal protections actually held any water under the Constitution. I'm sure we all know who we're talking about. That's right, friend of the pod, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Back in 1925, one William Humphrey had been appointed to the Federal Trade Commission by Calvin Coolidge. Humphrey was an outspoken conservative who really stuck in FDR's craw. FDR kept writing Humphrey letters, telling him please resign, and trying to get him to leave his job. When that didn't work, Humphrey didn't leave, FDR just fired Humphrey and dared the courts to tell him that the for-cause protections in the FTC statute were enforceable. In one of those interesting twists of fate, Humphrey actually died of a stroke about 5 months after FDR fired him. So it was actually his estate, his executor, that sued the federal government, arguing that because Humphrey had been fired in violation of the for-cause protection in the FTC statute, he was still owed his salary, and thus the government needed to pay his estate 5 months' worth of back pay. In the 1935 case, Humphrey's executor versus the United States, the Supreme Court unanimously held that this kind of for-cause protection for agency appointees was constitutional, as long as the law under which Congress created the relevant independent agency indicated that it was supposed to be independent and nonpartisan, plus a couple of other complicated details that we won't get into here. Upshot is that in 1935, the Supreme Court gave the okay to independent agencies, and all of the federal labor agencies are independent agencies. So in theory, the only churn and inefficiency that should occur surrounding these agencies' heads, leaving or being appointed, can be somewhat planned around, will occur at the end of staggered terms, or in the very rare instance where one of these guys fucks up bad enough to be fired for cause. Well, here's the thing. In the years since the 30s, conservatives have come to fucking hate Humphrey's executor, even though conservatives back in the day were the ones who were actually all for it because of how much they hated FDR. History's funny that way. Modern conservatives see Humphrey's executor as an annoying obstacle to being able to get a corporate-backed Republican into office who then will wield complete control over the administrative state and defang it. So for the past decade or so, there have been rumblings that once conservatives had control of the Supreme Court again, they'd try to kill Humphrey's executor. And that's pretty much exactly what's going to happen. Back in January 2025, Trump fired a bunch of the heads of administrative agencies and did not do so for cause. He did so deliberately, for the precise purpose of challenging Humphrey's executor and seeing if the Supreme Court would overrule that precedent and find that, actually for the past 100 years or so, we've been doing it all wrong, and Congress can't insulate agencies from being at-will fireable by the president. The Supreme Court has already heard the case, and all indications seem to be that they have the votes to overturn Humphreys. I'm telling you right now, they're going to find that the president can fire the heads of any administrative agency except for maybe the Federal Reserve, which really isn't an administrative agency. Anyway, I digress. There's maybe a conversation to be had about whether or not it's actually a good idea to give the president greater control over what happens in federal agencies. That's a little bit above our pay grade for now. Instead, I just want to talk about the practical effects Humphrey being overruled will have on the federal labor agencies we've been discussing. First off, I need to explain what quorum is. The federal labor agencies have a requirement that there has to be a certain number of agency heads in place or the agency can't do any business, including deciding and issuing cases. For the NLRB, it's 3 agency heads or 3 board members. For the NMB, it's 2. Why do I mention this? Well, one of the agency heads Trump fired back in January 2025 was an agency head of the NLRB. This brought the number of then active NLRB agency heads to 2, meaning the NLRB didn't have a quorum, which in turn meant the NLRB couldn't issue any decisions, just straight up couldn't do any of its enforcement activities. Employers could fire employees for being pro-union and threaten them or close businesses for being pro-union, and there wasn't shit the NLRB could do about it, other than have the regional offices file a complaint and wait for the NLRB to have quorum again once the president and the Senate got around to appointing someone new. Because Trump had other things on his mind, and because of congressional politics, and because if you're a tinfoil guy like me, there were a lot of powers that be that actually didn't want the NLRB to be functioning, it took a really long time for the board to get quorum again. In fact, it took until December of 2025 for the board to get quorum again. In fact, while it lacked quorum, another board member's term was up, and so the board went down to just 1 active agency head, so Trump had to get 2 new members appointed. We just talked about how fucking slow the NLRB and NMB are already. How do you think not being able to issue any cases for a year affects that? Answer, by making things even more fucking slow than they were before. That 2 to 3 year time I mentioned before, tack on another year to that, at best. Most likely the backlog over there, plus Trump's new appointees wanting to change a ton of precedent, means that if you got unlawfully fired for being pro-union or anti-union back in March of 2025, you might, if you're really lucky, have your case resolved in your favor before 2029. So why am I mentioning this quorum thing? Well, because when Humphrey's executor gets overruled, the first thing that every president is going to do once he gets elected, assuming he's succeeding a president from the opposite party, is to fire all the agency heads that the past president appointed. This will deny the agencies, including the labor agencies, quorum and make them sit on their hands for an extended period, months, maybe a year, maybe longer, as the president and Congress get their shit together and find people to appoint and hold committee votes and then actually appoint the new people to the agencies. Then another year will pass as the new appointees get integrated, start working to reverse all the precedent changes the past have been put in place. So then you get maybe 2 years of normal functioning, or at least only average dysfunction, before the process maybe repeats again. And don't let Democrats fool you. They're decrying the end of Humphreys now because there's a freaking Cheeto in the White House, haven't you heard? So they're making a big stink about the fact that he's getting rid of liberal-leaning agency heads. But I promise you this. After Humphreys is gone and a Democrat gets elected president, he's not going to turn up his nose at the power that Humphreys' reversal gives him. He's going to get in there and clean house and fire all the Trump appointees. And Democrats will conveniently forget all their prior ideological objections to having that power and cheer him on for doing so. You know who loves all this delay and dysfunction and turnover? People who violate federal labor law. If you know that you can fall through the cracks, if you know that you'll only get punished in 5 years for firing a pro-union troublemaker right now, if you can string along a less well-resourced union for 2, 3, 5 years in court without reaching a first contract, then at the end of the day, anti-union employers and bad-intentioned unions are going to win almost every single time when they are going up against the American worker. Not to be corny, but justice delayed really is justice denied, and if you know that the feds will simply be too slow to be effective when it comes to protecting your rights, why are you going to stick your neck out and try and unionize your workplace? So now we have the 4 reasons that, at least as I see it, sky-high pro-union sentiment hasn't translated into greater organizing activity. 1. Figuring out which labor law you fall under is really fucking confusing because of the tangle of state and federal laws on the matter. 2. Employers have gotten really good at being tricky and either structuring their operations such that all of their workers are independent contractors on paper, or just lying to their employees and telling them they're independent contractors when they're actually not. 3. Government/field preemption don't just act as a floor for labor rights, they act as a ceiling that actively constrains the ability of localities or states to provide for more pro-labor schemes, including by preventing localities from imposing penalties for behavior that the federal laws currently punish with make-whole remedies or impotent notice postings. 4th, these federal agencies function so fucking slowly that they basically can't actually enforce the federal laws anymore, and the upcoming Supreme Court decision that will overrule Humphrey's executor will only make this problem worse by increasing the churn and delay at the formerly independent agencies as new agencies get hired and then fired every time the admin turns over. Whew. Pretty bleak stuff here, folks. With these problems identified, though, it's time to stop complaining and actually start recommending some solutions. How do we address these problems? And to absolutely nobody's surprise, if you've read the title of the podcast, why is it that I think localism offers the best path forward to giving people greater union rights? Actually, I want to start by dealing with 2 of these problems I just mentioned simultaneously, the problem of the tangle of labor law schemes and the problem of field preemption ceiling preventing local innovation / giving violations actual penalties. Let's assume that we wake up tomorrow and America has become a localist country. In other words, has become a country where the pyramid of preemption has turned upside down and local laws now preempt inconsistent state and federal laws. How could we use that new legal scheme to address tangled labor law schemes and paltry federal penalties? Simple. We blow the roof off of those federal labor schemes while keeping the floor in place. Now, in theory, under a localist system, we could choose to bypass the federal scale labor schemes altogether and create a specific labor ecosystem tailored to our community's values, and we'll talk a bit more about that possibility in a second. But here's another option. We don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Communities across America go to their town halls and say, we like the base level of protection that federal labor laws give us. We like the idea of having that as a foundation to build on. And, maybe we don't want to rewrite the entire scheme of labor law or recreate labor courts in our county. Sounds like a pain in the ass. So instead, here's what we're going to do. We're going to keep the NLRB and the NMB around in our community, and we're going to respect the jurisdiction. We're just going to tweak a thing here or there. We're going to make it so that in addition to what the feds say, you'll also have to pay the local government a penalty if you threaten someone for supporting a union or commit another ULP. No, we don't have to get rid of the bones of the current system. Maybe we think there's a decent skeleton there. We're just going to put some flesh on them when it comes to how things work where we live. Fill them out in the places that you and your community think are the most important, whatever those places might be. And it may be the case that in a post-localist reforms America, you live in a community that isn't quite as enamored with organized labor as the rest of us, and as I obviously am. You and your community might look at how the current system works and go, actually, we think this is about right in terms of how the balance of rights should work. Well, the great thing about using localism to address these problems is that localism allows you to keep the floor and the ceiling of field preemption if that's what you want. Localism doesn't mean that you have to pass new laws that override federal law within the borders of your community. It just means that you can if you want to. It turns a one-size-fits-all, inflexible, DC politics-centric system into one where every community gets to decide for itself how it wants to approach the issue of organized labor, including by keeping that one-size-fits-all, DC-centric sweater because it's actually pretty comfy. Thank you very much. Alternatively, there is the option of just sweeping away the federal cobwebs altogether, saying anything goes in your community or substituting a totally new labor scheme. We're actually getting a look at what this wild west of labor relations absent the federal labor laws might look like right now, and the result may not be as employer-favoring as you think it might. Okay, so in addition to the stuff we talked about above, you might be interested to know that at the time of writing, the NLRA literally cannot be enforced in certain parts of the country. Explaining why requires, yet again, another tangent, so stick with me here. A while back, Elon Musk's SpaceX was facing down the barrel of some labor law violations. As a result, SpaceX turned to the currently in vogue argument of companies trying to avoid their labor law duties. It argued that the NLRB is, for one reason or another, unconstitutional. And the circuit court, specifically the Fifth Circuit, the one that covers Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas, not exactly places known for being union-friendly, agreed. The Fifth Circuit did more than agree. It said that because the NLRB was structured unconstitutionally, it would cause SpaceX and any other party before the NLRB irreparable harm to be subject to any NLRB administrative proceeding. What does that mean? Well, it means that, at least in the areas that the Fifth Circuit covers, and at least until the Supreme Court speaks on this issue, nobody, not a union, not an employer, not a person, can bring a case through the NLRB. It'll just get appealed to the Fifth Circuit, and the Fifth Circuit will enjoin it because the court views the NLRB as unconstitutionally structured. The upshot of this is that for all intents and purposes, the NLRA right now just does not exist in the states covered by the Fifth Circuit. It doesn't exist for unions, but it also doesn't exist for employers. Because if a union did something unlawful under the NLRB and an employer filed an unfair labor practice to try and stop it, then the union could just make the same unconstitutionality argument that SpaceX successfully used. This has created a very interesting situation in the Fifth Circuit. Listen to these quotes from Alvin Vasquez's great Bloomberg Law article entitled SpaceX's Court Victory Paves Way for a Labor Movement Revival. Quote, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit ruled that job protections for the National Labor Relations Board and the administrative law judges it employs are most likely unconstitutional. If the ruling holds, these previously independent officials will serve at the pleasure of a U.S. president who can fire them at will and has appointed officials who once represented interests that are hostile to organized labor. Several commentators have claimed that this ruling will hinder efforts to protect workers seeking to organize. I have a different take. The Fifth Circuit's ruling could lead to the labor movement's revival by striking down the NLRA's restrictions on secondary boycotts, refusals to handle hot cargo, and recognitional picketing. End quote. Bluntschli jumping back in here. Refusing to handle hot cargo is when one workplace refuses to do business with a second workplace in order to pressure that second workplace to cave on a labor dispute. Recognitional picketing is the act of picketing an employer for the purpose of pressuring them to recognize a union. And secondary boycotts are the practice of encouraging customers not to shop at places that do businesses with a workplace that is currently in the middle of a labor dispute. Recognitional picketing is heavily curtailed under the NLRA, and secondary boycotts and hard cargo practices are outright forbidden. Okay, back to the article. Quote, if the NLRA is ruled unconstitutional, then states can create their own regimes to regulate collective bargaining. As Cornell professor Gali Risabi, sorry, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, demonstrates, 19 states from across the political spectrum have laws that protect collective bargaining if a court strikes down the NLRA that come immediately into effect. Unions could choose to boycott neutral companies to pressure other companies that they're combating to settle without legal sanction. Dock workers could refuse to handle goods that are subject to a labor dispute without sanction. While state laws prohibiting these actions would remain in effect, bans on these activities would no longer be national in scope. The potential for labor unrest and strife would be massive, and a tactical toolbox for labor to exploit would open up. However, in the law of the jungle, employers could access new tactics to squelch nation organizing campaigns. For example, they would be able to fire labor activists legally in many states without running afoul of anti-discrimination laws or lock out workers who go on strike. The potential for mischief and unrest would be vast. End quote. Put simply, if the NLRA goes away, then suddenly unions have a shit ton more tools at their disposal to pressure employers. Sure, it also means that employers can do whatever they want when it comes to firing or threatening employees for being pro-union or refusing to sign collective bargaining agreements or what have you. But as we've just spent, oh my god, my timer says like 3 hours, almost 3 hours discussing. Oh, geez, I'm going to need to probably go back and cut this up. What a disaster of an episode. As we've just spent like 3 hours discussing, that's the way it practically already is. Employers can already do all that shit because our labor laws don't work. And even when they do, the agencies are so slow that it's practically meaningless. It's already the case that employers can do whatever they want when it comes to firing or threatening employees for being pro-union or refusing to sign CBAs. Maybe we could use a little more law of the jungle around here. Maybe we could use some mischief and unrest to remind the corporations and the rich elites that it's workers who have the power, not them. And some of this also goes back to how you philosophically view the NLRA, especially the NLRA in light of all those conservative amendments it's been subject to over the years. Is the NLRA, at the end of the day, a worker-centric, rights-focused law that empowers workers to make their own choices about labor representation? Or is it really an imposition from moneyed interests who view it as a good way to keep rocks from going through factory windows and workers from doing unprofitable things like striking, and any rights the NLRA provides are just the bare minimum crumbs that needed to be added to the law to give it political cover. And if the law of the jungle in the Fifth Circuit gives labor a jolt of energy, then what if the same law of the jungle applied elsewhere? What if under a localist system that swept away both the floor and the ceiling of garment and field preemption, a community simply decided that within its jurisdiction there were no more labor laws? All sides could do as they saw fit to figure out the labor disputes as long as no property was getting destroyed or people getting hurt. Well, that would certainly shake things up a bit, wouldn't it? Breaking character for a moment, I'm genuinely not sure whether the approach of keeping the bones of the federal system around or just going with the law of the jungle and letting the chips fall where they may is better for organized labor. But the beautiful thing about localism is that difficult questions like these that every community is going to have to answer for itself are allowed to actually be answered on a community by community, person by person basis. Your town can do one solution. The county over can do another one. And neither of you will have to fight the other in order to have control over what laws apply in your own backyard, as you would if you were subject to a higher state or federal authority. Everyone just gets to decide for themselves. That's the localist pitch, baby. So that helps explain why localism would help address the issues of garment and field preemption's effects on labor rights. But what about the confusing tangle of labor schemes? Didn't I just say that I would explain localism's applicability to both the preemption and the tangle of schemes issues at the same time? You're very right, listener. The reason why I put these two problems together is because the solution to the thicket of labor schemes is basically the same solution to the field preemption problem. With localism in place, you and your community could come together and decide to keep all these different labor schemes around, just tweak things a bit around the edges. You and your community could, for example, say that actually from now on, if a case involving agricultural workers or domestic workers arises in our community, the NLRB has to hear it and treat the workers as employees covered by the NLRA. Bam, simpler scheme already. You could even go further by making all local government employees subject to NLRA jurisdiction as well, or some subset of local government employees anyway. With just those two little tweaks, you've turned a 4-scheme environment into a 2-scheme environment, just the RLA and the NLRA. And if you wanted, you could go crazy and say from now on, there is no RLA scheme in our community. All rail and airline and space workers that operate within the jurisdiction of our local government are NLRB employees now. Bam, there now is only one labor scheme that workers in your county or town or city need to navigate. Or you could do absolutely none of these things and opt to totally leave the current labor schemes alone. Again, localism is about giving each community options, including the option to decide that things are okay as they are and that no changes are necessary. The key is that it's you and your neighbors and your family and your community making that decision rather than a mass of citizens who live 1,000 miles away or a bunch of bought and paid for politicians in Washington, D.C. Alternatively, maybe your community takes the go for broke approach and says, you know what, no, we don't even want the bones of the old federal schemes. We're going to make our own labor law and own labor courts with blackjack and hookers, and that scheme is going to cover all workers in the jurisdiction of our local government. Again, this simplifies things significantly for workers because now instead of needing to navigate 4 potential schemes, workers just need to know and understand the labor system in place in their own community, the place where they live and work. Isn't it a lot easier to just pay attention to what's happening close to home rather than follow administrative vagaries that are happening in D.C.? Moving on, let's get into the independent contractor problem. Honestly, you're not going to be surprised by anything I'm about to say because it's just going to echo the local solutions we were discussing immediately before. Localism could solve this confusing problem of definitions by having you and your community simply pass one clear definition of independent contractor that will be treated as definitive for any labor dispute in your community, and require the federal labor agencies to respect that definition when hearing a case that arises in your jurisdiction. You alternatively could do away with the independent contractor distinction altogether and just say, fuck it, everyone is an employee now for the purposes of labor law. Or you could sweep away the federal labor schemes altogether and just let workers and management fight it out and see who wins. Each of these paths have their own ups and downs, and each of them is probably better than the back and forth federal standards that exclude or don't exclude thousands of workers depending whose hands happen to be on the levers of power at a given time. Lastly, we have what I think is the thorniest and most pernicious problem of them all. The fact that the federal labor agencies are just slow and inefficient as fuck at doing their jobs, especially after Humphreys gets overruled. This most difficult of issues is also the one that is maybe the least susceptible to being solved via localism, or at least the version of localism where you sought to keep the current skeleton of the federal labor system in place. What do I mean by this? So as I just said, if you're trying to simplify the number of labor schemes in your community while keeping the federal schemes around, probably what you're doing is you're passing some local law that preempts federal law that says, okay, if this kind of dispute involving these kinds of workers arises in our jurisdiction, we want it to go to just one labor agency, not the rest, and we want it to be subject to just one federal labor law. The problem with this is that it's going to increase the intake of that particular federal labor agency you've chosen, whether that's the RLA or the NLRA, or whether that's the NMB or the NLRB. And because you on the ground, you technically could, under localism, pass some rule that said, okay, we specifically are going to pay the NLRB more money so they can hear more cases. Like, that's a bit much to ask of you and your community, right? These are supposed to be federal agencies. Everyone's supposed to phone them. So it isn't really a viable solution to say, okay, yes, we're going to be increasing the intake of these agencies, and our community is also going to pay for the agencies to hire more people to handle this increased intake. It's just not going to happen. Maybe you could collaborate with other localities and like all of you make some kind of joint commitment to increase the amount of taxes that you're paying and like require that the federal government make those taxes specifically applicable to the federal labor agency you've chosen to handle labor disputes in your jurisdiction. I don't know. It's tricky. You can see why this is not, this approach isn't as simple or as straightforwardly responsive to the problem of slowness and inefficiency as, for example, tweaking rules about who is or isn't an independent contractor or what labor law schemes do or do not apply to particular workers within your community. This is this area of federal agency inefficiency, of agencies being removed from what's happening on the ground, of agencies being politically captured and going back and forth and being responsive to all these political interests that are coming in from various parts of the country. This is an area where arguably the best solution is just to sweep away the federal scheme altogether, to simply create, a new federal labor agency within your own community that hears all labor disputes that might arise within your jurisdiction and has final say, subject to maybe you could say they can appeal it to a state court or whatever, or maybe you say they can't. Maybe you say whenever you have a labor dispute, it goes to the, Labor Court of Austin, Texas, or the Labor Court of San Francisco, and whatever those labor judges say, that's what goes. I tried to make the point in the other areas where we were talking about how localism could solve the problems of the current federal labor scheme that, there are some options here that communities can opt to go for, and they can opt to do nothing. But this area of just how bad the federal agencies are at their job, I don't know if there is much of another option if this is something that you're worried about, other than just saying, okay, we're going to create a brand new labor scheme at home. And under localism, you could choose to do that. It would be difficult. You would have to figure out where to find the money and where to find the experts. But you could do it. And the result would be a labor legal apparatus that is closer to the communities where disputes are arising, who will understand the consequences of their decisions, and who could operate much more flexibly and nimbly and in an unencumbered manner because the number of people that they're hearing from isn't nationwide, it's just those within your own community. Whew. What an episode, am I right? I know I'm going to have to go back and split this up, so I imagine you probably just finished listening to an unplanned part 2 of Localism and Organized Labor. Thanks for sticking through what I think is going to be the longest localism episode or episodes ever. And next time we're going to be doing something much, much shorter. With the new year approaching, I'm going to try and focus on growing the channel and making some more approachable content and not 2-hour-long rants. So come back sometime soon for a quick episode on some of my hot takes on political trends we'll see emerge in the next 10 years or so. There'll be 3 of these localism political hot takes, and at the risk of sounding like a clickbait thumbnail, number 3 will shock you. Thanks for a really great first year of the Localist podcast together, guys. I really appreciate my audience, and I'm looking forward to bringing you some great content and some great discussion once the new year arrives. See you then. If you've enjoyed this content and you're interested in seeing what the new year is going to look like, then please be sure to follow the Localist podcast on Spotify or on our YouTube channel at Localist Pod. That's Localist with a T, Pod. If these long-form podcasts aren't your thing, then we also do these great 3-minute long YouTube shorts that give a more condensed version of the podcast episodes. You can find those on our YouTube channel, Localism Podcast, and check us out on Blue Sky at localistpod.bluesky.social. Again, that's localist with a T, pod.bluesky.social. Finally, if you have any questions or comments, send me an email at localistpod, again, that's localist with a T, pod@gmail.com. A huge thank you to Kevin MacLeod for letting me use the 2 songs in this podcast, Acid Jazz and Opportunity Walks. You can find these and a bunch of other really great songs on Kevin's website, incompetech.com. And the use of Kevin's music here is licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 4.0.